Shares for beginners. Phil Muscatello and Finpods are authorised reps of Money Sherpa. The information in this podcast is general in nature and doesn't take into account your personal situation.
What I wanted to get out there for people, I wanted to kind of like get young people of all ages to know that investing isn't something that's full of jargon and it isn't something that, needs to be kind of really complicated. So that's why, for example, the slogan of my book is simplifying investing for all. I want to kind of demystify investing and get as many people as I can investing. That's really the key, really.
G'day and welcome back to Shares for Beginners. I'm Phil Muscatello. What animals are usually associated with the stock market? I'm thinking bulls and bears. But what about the humble sloth? Made famous by a quote from Warren Buffett, like so many great investing quotes. And he said, "Lethargy bordering on sloth remains the cornerstone of our investment style." Joining me in this episode is Mr. Sloth himself, RP Roy Stevens. G'day, Roy.
G'day, good to see you. It's a pleasure to join you, and I see this as a great opportunity to enable more Australians to learn the benefits of investing like a sloth. I've got quite a few buddies in Australia, and I think this would be a great chance for my Australian friends and others to learn about the benefits of investing like a sloth.
Yes, well, I can see you've taken the opportunity to mention that you have a friend in Australia who said he actually wanted to hear you on a local podcast, hence you're coming onto this podcast. So I feel used, but that's okay. I've been used before.
I love it.
Now, you're the author of The Sloth Investor, and I believe it's just released today, isn't it? June 28th, 2024?
Yeah. Hot off the press, June 28th, 2024. So this is an extremely busy day for me. There's a lot going on, but I had to definitely come on this podcast. I've heard good things about it, and I'm looking forward to kind of, having my Aussie friends hear about the book and so on. So really looking forward to it.
And you're in Hong Kong, aren't you?
Yeah, in Hong Kong. My wife and I, we've been here for the past 6 years. We've got 2 young children, and we actually work in education, international education here. We've really enjoyed our time. We've worked abroad now for around about 14 years, but I would say Hong Kong has actually been the best fit for us. We joke because we used to work in the Middle East for 5 years, and over there it was like 50 shades of beige, so much beige. So when we came to Hong Kong, our kids could finally get used to the color green. It's like an abundance green. We live in a New Territories region, probably about an hour from Central, so quite far away from the skyscrapers, but our kids love it here, we love it. You get the best of both worlds. We live quite close to a beach. We've got beautiful mountains nearby. You can go for hikes. And one day I would like to actually visit Australia. My wife was actually fortunate when she was younger. She lived in Port Macquarie for 1 year when she was 13. I've yet to visit Australia. And at the age of 41, I'm ashamed to say that. But seeing as we're over this side of the world, quite far away from my native UK, looking forward to eventually visiting Australia over the next few years.
We kind of like it.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about the book. Now, it's one of the premises about human psychology is that we're taught from an early age to strive and to exert ourselves. Why is it different for investing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and I make that point at the very beginning of my book, actually. I happen to be a big Beatles fan, and I think it's become quite widely known now, I guess. But, there's a book written by Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers, and he came up with this kind of like 10,000 hours, or he popularized it anyway, 10,000 hours. I touched upon John Lennon. Bruce Lee, of course, took many hours and hours of activity and practice. And I also mentioned Serena Williams, of course, because I happened to write a large chunk of the book when I think it was King Richard came out, the story of the Williams sisters' rise to stardom. And of course, all three of those individuals, what did it take to kind of get them to become the experts that they were? It's energy, activity, effort. But this is something that I find really, really fascinating about in investing. It's one of those counterintuitive things of which I think there are many. And that's the fact that when it comes to investing, it's less effort, it's less activity. There was actually a really famous study many years ago by Fidelity, and they looked into who are the most successful investors. And the study found that the most successful investors were those that had either, passed away or had forgotten about their portfolio. And I just think that one of the key reasons why so many people get themselves into problems is because they tend to kind of tinker, they tend to kind of like analyze too much. And I think contemporary technology, is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, I think it's great now, the kind of democratization of information. It's so easy now to open a brokerage account, to, buy shares and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I guess at times there's too little friction. It is easy to go in, isn't it? And just check to see how your portfolio is doing, to want to tinker and so on. And I like what Buffett says about the bar of soap, that famous analogy, your portfolio is somewhat akin to a bar of soap. What happens to a bar of soap, the more we play with it in our hands, the more we tinker with it, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And he makes that point about our portfolio. So, yeah, I'm really, and again, this is why I've chosen the humble sloth as my investing spirit animal, because I really do fundamentally believe that that is the best animal to characterize successful investing, because really investors, less is more. Get on with your life. I love reading. I'm going to be spending some time in the UK this summer. I'm looking forward to diving back into some non-fiction, some history. I've got a fiction book over there I'm going to read, and get on with your life. Spend time with your kids if you have kids, play sport, read, whatever you want to do, but just don't succumb to kind of analysis paralysis. Just get on with your life and let the stock market do its work that it has done for the last 100 to 150 years. Yeah.
I just want to point out that this juncture that we often end up talking about music, and you mentioned the Beatles and you're a Beatles fan. I just want to make it clear I'm a Stones guy myself here, okay?
Well, can I
love
be
the Beatles.
honest?
The Beatles are okay, but the Stones, really, they're a real true rock band.
Can I be honest with you? And it's one of my regrets that I don't mention Stones more, because I am actually more of a Stones guy myself. I've seen the Stones 9 times in the past, 20 years. I'm actually quite fortunate that I've met Bill Wyman many years ago in my hometown in the UK. I got an autograph by him, one of his books, and it's the Stones for me. Just seen them so many times. It's quite sad, but I'm actually on one of their DVDs. I went to see the Stones at Twickenham Rugby Stadium many years ago. My father had a 40 Licks tour, and it was filmed for a DVD. Towards the end of the show, Mick sticks his tongue out to the crowd, as is customary of him, I guess. The camera pans round, and there I am with my dad jumping down. So the Stones, I just absolutely love the Stones. But sometimes people ask me, gosh, you seem to love the Stones and the Beatles. What would it be? I guess for me it would be something, I don't know, 60-40. So 60% Stones, 40% Beatles. I just love both those bands. But yeah, the Stones, and would edge it for me, Mick's charisma, Keith, Charlie, who sadly passed away a few years ago. I just love the Stones.
And there was that great book that Bill Wyman wrote about the Stones. Was it Stone Alone, I think?
Stone Alone, that's right.
Yeah.
Stone Alone,
and like they were going through, he was writing about their stages of success, and after the US tour, and at the end of each chapter, he would mention their bank balance at the time. And they'd come back from touring the United States, and the bank balance was £10,
Shillings.
40p.
Oh,
shillings, something like that. Like $10 was in the account at the end of the tour, and it was hilarious because they were ripped off so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell you why I have a kind of a special affinity for the Stones too, is the fact that my hometown is Alpenton in Kent in UK, and Keith went to art school in Sidcup. I also went to secondary school in Sidcup, and Mick and Keith's hometown, Dartford, Kent, is actually not too far from my hometown. I actually had some friends who went to Dartford Grammar School, which is the same as Mick. So just, deep links and roots to Mick and Keith. And even, just not to linger at Stones point too much, but many years ago when I was a student, I went to, University in North of England. I would come back home, Easter, Christmas, summertime, and I was fortunate to work for a company in which I was kind of, working security, students, so on and so forth. And an ultimate dream was in summer 2003, I got to work at the Stone show at the London Astoria. I got to work in a backstage area. And I'll never forget, it was only 2 words, but my gosh, Charlie Watts, the Rolling Stones drummer, spoke to me. He said, "Good afternoon." I'm just like, that was the highlight of my day, just like Charlie Watts spoke to me. And I do remember Keith Richards was quite charismatic that day. He just happened to be greeting people with one love. So I just love in a typically Keith fashion. So yeah, deep connections to Stones. And again, I think partly because my parents were more Stones fans than Beatles as well.
So, to segue back into investing,
sorry.
And I think Keith is an example of this, that some of the greatest music can be written by taking your time about it, by not by letting it grow by itself. And I was just talking to a financial planner actually just about an hour before recording this episode, and he was saying, and we were talking about this particular thing about wanting to strive, wanting to do something, that it's actually about the way our brains are wired, isn't it? We're evolutionarily wired to try and do something, and the idea of sitting back and doing nothing is quite foreign and actually quite hard to achieve.
Yeah, I touch upon that in my book as well, so I'll dive deep into each of them later, but I've got 5 bedrock principles. When I explore the 5th bedrock principle, headstrong, I talk about the fact that, as humans inherently, we have cognitive biases, and one is action bias. And like you quite rightly say, we are programmed to do something. We're programmed to act. And when I talk to people about this, I sometimes often think about the FANG stocks, the last, 10, 15 years. What are those stocks that have been a poster boys, if you like, for the stock market, where it's Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, supposed acronym FANG. And while on the one hand, those stocks have been doing really well and, they've made our life easy. You can buy my book and, instantly on Amazon, you can get an Uber so quickly, you can watch Netflix, binge watch and so on. I do sometimes wonder if the fact that they've conditioned us to immediate gratification, what that has in our contemporary psyche, we've become so spoiled, if you like, we really have. And, I do wonder if there's a detriment to that, so yeah, we seem to want to kind of achieve things so quickly. But I touch upon in my book as well, you think about the achievements in your life, whether it was learning to play a musical instrument, learning a language, perhaps even learning to drive, those things take time. And similar, I think it's so critically key to have that kind of long-term horizon, it's decades, not days. And that's, again, going back one more bedrock principle. My fifth bedrock principle is headstrong. My fourth one is time, which I'm happy to explore later as well. But time is so critical, really, it really is.
Yeah, well, we're going to go through those in a moment.
Sure,
but
absolutely.
Let's get back to why did you write the book? What was it about? Are you from a finance background or?
Yeah, good question. I wish I was. I really wish I was. So I grew up in a family of non-investors. Both my parents sadly passed away now, but neither of them invested. There was little or no mention of the stock market in my house growing up. If ever I heard about the stock market, it was only through maybe just occasional broadcast on a television, the stock market went down today, went up and so on, but I really took no particular interest really. And it's funny because I'm not much of a romantic comedies guy, but I always think about this romantic comedy from the late 90s with Gwyneth Paltrow, like Sliding Doors. And I guess my sliding doors moment was when I met my father-in-law. So my father-in-law, John, was someone that had a really profound influence upon me. So, several months after meeting my then girlfriend who became wife, she introduced me to her father. And I guess, he would gradually start to talk to me about investing. And if I'm honest with you, I was quite ignorant. I really didn't want to know. For me, it was like, no, that's a heady off world, off limits world. It's not for me. I had a bit of a kind of imposter syndrome in that respect, investing imposter syndrome. I wasn't interested. And I guess gradually after 3, 4, 5 chats, he started to kind of like really make an effect. He's talked to me about compound interest, for example, the importance of not getting into debt. This guy called Warren Buffett, who I'd never heard of, and he started to make a bit more sense to me. So I guess it was talking to him. And then also there was another key catalyst, which was a book that I read by Andrew Hallam. Now, he was a former international school teacher himself. So he was reading Andrew Hallam's Millionaire Teacher, which introduced me to the concept of index funds, talking to my father-in-law. Those were 2 key catalysts. And going back to your question about why I wrote a book, I guess I'm thinking back to myself about wanting to sound too corny or cliche. I wanted to write a book that I would have loved to have been given when I was 18, 19. So I started to get interested in investing when I was in my late 20s, when I met my father-in-law, and I read Millionaire Teacher around about 28, 29. And I look back, I think, why was there not a book out for me? Why was I not able to, meet someone at 18, 19 that could talk to me about investing? And I guess also someone else asked me a similar question the other day. I guess it's frustration, a sense of frustration, whereby I think there are many great books about investing, but many of them are rich in theory, but perhaps lacking in utility. And that's something I do in my book, is the fact that I give kind of sample portfolios, whether you're an Aussie, a Brit, an American, a Canadian, wherever you're in the world, sample portfolios that you can put to use and kind of, invest like a sloth in that way. So yeah, I guess it stems from what I wanted to get out there for people. I wanted to kind of like get young people of all ages to know that investing isn't something that's full of jargon, and it isn't something that, needs to be kind of really complicated. So that's why, for example, the slogan of my book is simplifying investing for all. I want to kind of demystify investing and get as many people as I can investing. And that's really the key, really.
Okay, well, let's run through the 5 principles.
Yeah.
And sloth is the mnemonic, I guess, for it, which is simplicity, low fees, owning the world, time, and headstrong. Run us through. Let's start with simplicity.
Yeah. So simplicity really, for me, stems from the late, great Jack Bogle. This is someone who I believe has, had such a monumental influence upon the world of investing. I think back to a great book I read a few years ago by Robin Wigglesworth. He wrote a book called Trillions. And in that book, he talks about Bogle's notion of the index fund being the Manhattan Project of financial management, which I love, and coming hot on the heels of Oppenheimer last year. I think it's a really good term. For me, simplicity is key, because if you think about most realms of life, most realms of life, life can be quite complex. If you're, taking exams, if you learn to drive a car and so on, it really can be. But again, this is one of those counterintuitive points about investing that fascinates me. It's the fact that professionals don't always necessarily know the best. You can, going back to Aesop's fable, the hedgehog and the fox, which I guess I can get to later, you can achieve success through simply investing in a low-fee, globally diversified portfolio. You can keep things simple. In chapter 1 of my focus on simplicity in the book, I reference a Bogle conference. He spoke at a conference, I think it was the tail end of 1999, and he spoke about simplicity as being the ultimate sophistication in terms of investing simplicity. So simplicity for me is critically key. And then naturally what follows on from that is low fees. So if you're going to adopt a simple approach to investing, investing broadly index funds, then naturally what should follow is that that shouldn't require high fees. So low fees for me is key. And then going back to compound interest, if you're paying high fees, well, those high fees are going to compound. They really are. And again, going back to one of those counterintuitive points about investing, you think about most realms of life. If I, have a back issue, I may pay a little bit extra to get a superior medical professional to look at. If I've got a dental work problem, and I often, in the past have had dental issues, I may want to pay a little bit extra to go for that superior level of dentist, for example. But when it comes to investing, this is one of those domains in which actually low fees are likely to bring you greater reward. High fees, like I mentioned, are going to compound. So low fees, and again, we can attribute that to the late, great Jack Bogle and Vanguard, his company. Own a World, this really stems from, for example, a great book that I read several years ago by a chap called Lars Kroyer called Investing Demystified. Now, Lars was a hedge fund manager who worked on a London stock exchange. He wrote a lovely book called Investing Demystified. And in that book, he spoke about the importance of, a globally diversified portfolio. And he was the one that really introduced, I guess, built upon what Andrew Hallam mentioned about having a portfolio that is a representative of the world stock market as a whole. So I talk in a book, none of us have a crystal ball. How do we know which percentage of our portfolio to kind of apportion to Australia or the UK or the US or Japan and so on? But Lars Kroyer talks at length about these kind of low-fee, globally diversified portfolios by Vanguard that mirror the kind of percentage representation of the world stock market. So there's one I investing on the London Stock Exchange, the Vanguard FTSE All World Fund, and about 65% of that fund is allocated to US, 4% to UK, 7% Japan, and so on and so forth. So yeah, Own a World, key influences of me, Lars Kroyer, Andrew Hallam, people even such as Daniel Crosby have spoken about that. And then just coming back to time, we briefly touched upon it earlier, but I speak in my book about someone called Grace Grunner. And I speak about 3 ordinary people that became extraordinary investors in my chapter called Once Upon a Time. One of them is Grace Grunner. Now, she was a secretary, just a humble secretary. And she passed away in 2010, I believe it was. And when she passed away, she left $7 million US. And that was held in a trust for a local school, a series of schools, I believe, in Chicago, I think it was in the States. And the point I want to make about her in time is that from a young age, she continued invested again and again and again in the stock market. So time is critically key. I mentioned on my book, a book that I read several years ago by Carl Honore. It's Honre. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but he wrote a great book called In Praise of Slowness. And again, he talks about the fact that, in our contemporary world, we're so keen to rush around, get things done, whereas really just taking a slow approach, getting things done, not necessarily multitasking, just taking it slow is the way to go. So yeah, I think time is particularly hard in this day and age, but the younger you start, the better it's going to be. And just, I go back to what I think Charlie Munger says, the first rule of compounding is, not to let it stop. Don't let compounding stop. Through thick and thin, just keep on investing through the good times and the bad,
ETFs are great products. We all know that they're great products. But then, again, you can start overthinking even just simple things like that. Now, you mentioned that particular Vanguard. So that covers basically stock markets around the world. But, there's many investors who go, okay, well, I'm here in Australia and I'll, do an ASX 200 ETF. Then I'll get the, S&P 500 ETF. Oh, I better get the NASDAQ as well. Oh, what about bullion? Okay, I better get a gold ETF, and just found out about fixed income and bonds, maybe a bond ETF as well.
Yeah.
And suddenly becomes active management. And that's the idea.
Yeah.
We want passive management. We don't want active management. How would you suggest people sort of think about that, and in terms of, again, simplifying their own investment process?
Yeah, I mean, as best as possible, what I would say is you want to kind of like reduce the funds that you're buying. So someone said to me, relative novice, one of my friends back in the UK recently, in a phone conversation, said, okay, I'm going to buy, India's looking really good. I'm going to buy an India ETF and I'm going to buy an emerging markets fund with South America. I'm going to buy the US and S&P
You've seen it.
500.
You've seen this too, have you?
Yeah, exactly. And the point I'm trying to make to people is that, you can catch all of them in one fund. So the fund I buy, gives you exposure to developing markets, emerging markets, if you like. But one thing I would say is, I'm flying to the UK tomorrow. We were talking about this prior to the podcast, weren't we, beginning? And one thing I love in the UK is going for a nice curry. I love going for a nice curry with my wife and kids. But the interesting thing is, I've got quite a spicy palate. I love food that's spicy. My kids, my wife, not so much. So to bring it back to investing, the point I would make is that we've all got our own unique investing palate. So I would never be one of these to be a diehard, or every single investor must have a low fee, globally diversified index fund. It must be 100%. So I make the point in my book that, it may well be that you might want to be someone that tinkers at the edges of maybe, 10, 15% of your portfolio in individual stocks. Maybe you do want to go, for a bit of gold, whatever it might be. So I'm very much not someone who's a devout, everyone must invest in a way I say kind of guy. But I do fundamentally believe, though, that for investors, a significant percentage of your portfolio should be in the stock market as a whole, because over time, I love in presentations getting out that stock market chart, showing people how over time the stock market has gone up. So yeah, if you want to kind of like invest in some FANG stocks or a hot stock that if it's a company that your uncle works for and he thinks it's great, go and do that. But I tend to be quite conservative as an investor myself. I'm someone who very early on, and this again stems back to my father-in-law. My father-in-law tends to be someone that he himself doesn't tend to invest in index funds. He tends to invest in individual stocks, as opposed to Andrew Hallam, whose book I mentioned earlier. So yeah, by all means, if you want to kind of like tinker at the edges of individual stocks, by all means do it. But going back to what you said about, the various different funds, you just have to be careful again that, those fees are going to rack up if you're going for, an Aussie index fund, Japanese one, a South American, and so on. So you want to reduce fees as much as possible, because the lower your fees, the more your, overall portfolio is going to compound. So I hope that I was able to answer your question there, really. Yeah.
No, it's very good. But
Yeah.
it's also fees compound as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Super is one of the most important investments you'll ever make. But how do you know if you're in the best fund for your situation? Head to lifesherpa.com.au to find out more. Life Sherpa, Australia's most affordable online financial advice.
So you've kind of covered simplicity, low fees, owning the world and time. What's the H? Headstrong. What's that all about?
Yeah, so the H is headstrong. So for me, I make the point at the beginning of that chapter on headstrong that, investors don't need to look far to see what their biggest obstacle is. They just need to look in the mirror. I make that point because something I speak to my friends back home in the UK about is that many of them, particularly those who don't know much about investing, think, it's not for me, it's a numbers game and I need to be good at crunching numbers. And what's this thing, Roy, a PEG ratio, P ratio? I said, no, you don't need to worry about those ratios, for example. You just need to make sure you got it right upstairs. So psychology is absolutely key. And this, again, I touched upon in briefly earlier, but this is where, cognitive biases come into play. We're programmed as sentient beings to act, aren't we? So action bias, even things like recency bias I touch upon, the fact that, very often investors will look at how the stock market has performed for the past 2 years, and that will dictate how to behave. The stock market's not been doing so well, I'm not going to invest. Or, the stock market's been on a really good run, it's going to continue to be like that, I'm going to go all in, it's great, and so on. So, I make quite a few movie references in the book as well, and I happen to be a big Tarantino fan. I love the movies of Quentin Tarantino, and one of his favorites is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I make the point about, Brad Pitt, his character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood he played a stunt double, didn't he? And I make the point in my book that very often what investors need is they need their own stunt double, to behave in terms of, those intermittent periods when the stock market is extremely volatile and so on. And even I think it's important to remember that none of us are perfect. One of my favorite books, I mentioned it several times in my own book, The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins, and he touches upon the fact that even, I think Black Monday, I think it was 87 or 89, I think it was 87 Black Monday. He mentions that Black Monday, that famous day back in the late 80s, he succumbed. He sold a high percentage of his portfolio, and he speaks quite frankly and honestly about that. So, I can talk at length about cognitive biases in my book and the fact that we all need a stuntman. But, I've made mistakes in the past as well. I've kind of sold when I shouldn't have done. And I've kind of definitely made mistakes in the past as well with, having a short-term mindset. So this for me is, I guess it's quite a cathartic process. I'm trying to put into this book references to mistakes that I've made as well. But some people often pin me down and say, hey, Roy, if you had to kind of like pick your one or two favorite bedrock principles, headstrong is always like one or two. Simplicity, I think, is key, but headstrong, given the psychology of investing is so critically key, and we think about what is one of the, if not the most famous investing book, personal finance book of the past 5 years, it's The Psychology of Money, great title. And I think the reason why Morgan House has done so well with that book is because it just touches upon such a great point that, our brains and how we think and what we do with our brains, is so critically key to one's success as an investor. So yeah, in Headstrong, I really, really delve deeply into a series of cognitive biases, touch upon in-group bias, for example, sunk cost fallacy, recency bias. So yeah.
As long as your stunt double's not Brad Pitt in Fight Club, we are talking about the cool, calm, collected Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Great movie. I love that movie.
I love that. I love Tarantino. Yeah.
We all need to channel our own Brad Pitt to be the cool guy looking out for our best interests.
I think my wife would be far happy if I was Brad Pitt, but sadly I'm not. Sorry, Justine.
So on your website, you have your 4 favourite investors to follow. Who are they?
For example, I absolutely love Andrew Hallam. So Andrew Hallam would be absolutely, one of my favorites. I've spoken about him a few times already. So he's written The Millionaire Teacher. He's written Millionaire Expat. And one more recently he's written is Balance. And that's interesting because, yes, he talks about investing, but he also talks about, for example, what can we do in life to kind of be successful? How can we achieve success in our life, not just kind of through investing, but physiologically as well? So having healthy lifestyles, looking at the importance of experiences rather than things, which I can touch upon as well. Another person would be, for example, and I might even change some of the investors from that website because there's one also that comes to mind I think is not on the website that you reference. But one of would be Morgan Housel that I've touched upon as well. So Morgan Housel is probably my favorite investment writer. The Psychology of Money I've mentioned. I love what he has to say in The Psychology of Money about wealth is what you don't see. He makes the point about very often, and I think about my father-in-law here as well in that respect. So John, my father-in-law, lives in Germany now, but originally from the UK. He's always been quite frugal with his money. He doesn't kind of spend his money on lavish things. And also circling back to Morgan Housel, yes, many people know him now for The Psychology of Money, but I actually love the articles that he wrote during his time at the Motley Fool in the US. So I've read many of his articles during his time at the Motley Fool, and one of my favorites that I mentioned in my book is The Tyranny of the Calendar. And within the article, he mentions the fact that many investors, many institutional corporations tend to focus upon the 1-year return, maybe the 2-year return, but that's a very arbitrary time period, isn't it? 1 year. So this is why he talks about the tyranny of the calendar, i.e. too many people become really fixated and obsessed and stuck on the 1-year return, when really what matters is that date in the future, multiple decades down the line. So Morgan Housel I love. I would also touch upon, for example, it's a toss-up now for number 3 between J.L. Collins and Eric Balchunas. I'm actually going to go for Eric Balchunas, so I think I'm going to veer away from those 4 investors on my website. Eric Balchunas wrote a great book several years ago called The Bogle Effect. I've had him on my podcast myself. Now, I thought I knew quite a bit about Jack Bogle, but Eric Balchunas just writes at length about why Bogle merits so much acclaim and attention. He touches upon, a series of kind of analogies that Bogle used. And I guess a 4th person that I admire, and again, I don't think this is a person on the website, but this is constantly changing. I guess like my Rolling Stone songs, I'm constantly changing my top 5. I'm actually going to go for Will Rainey. This is for the kids and for the parents out there, because this is a book that I bought for my own children. I've got a 6 and a 9-year-old, and I absolutely love Grandpa's Fortune Fables. My 9-year-old is just about the age where I'd love to begin reading it to him. We're going on holiday to Europe tomorrow, actually, and I'd love to begin reading Grandpa's Fortune Fables to him. So for what he's done in terms of kind of, writing about financial principles, getting kids interested in personal finance, I'm probably going to go for Will Rainey, because I'm a big fan as well, on a final point, of people that kind of can help to demystify personal finance. So I think they'll be my 4. Andrew Hallam, Morgan Housel, Eric Balchunas, and Will Rainey.
And I'll put a link into the blog post as well and the episode notes that we've had Will on the podcast as well, talking about Grandpa's Fortune Fables. Yeah, he's a great guy and does a really good job of simplifying things as well for kids.
He does, absolutely.
I just want to circle back a little bit because you mentioned failure and how you've failed a couple of times. And I'm just putting out this point now because we've just announced in Sydney on July 25th, I'm doing a seminar with Vince Scully from Life Sherpa and Fiona Balzer from the Australian Shareholders Association. And we're calling it Confess Your Financial Failures to Father Phil and Brother Vince. And we're just going to actually talk about failure. So if anyone's interested in coming along to that event, please sign up at the Share site. I'll put a link in the episode notes as well about that. But you mentioned some failures. What are some of your favourite failures?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to mention two that come to mind immediately. One would be, for example, after having spoken to John, I then went on a bit of a book binge. He really got me interested in investing. So I started to kind of read, J.L. Collins, Andrew Hallam. I even really became a bit of a Warren Buffett geek. And this is, again, how I first learned of that great investment quote that you mentioned in the beginning. Lethargy, boredom, sloth remains a cornerstone of investment style. That's from his 1990 letter to shareholders. So I read various shareholder letters from Buffett and others. But I really, really sunk my teeth into index funds, particularly because of J.L. Collins and Andrew Hallam. But looking back in hindsight, I'm actually annoyed at myself because in my early years of investing, yes, I would invest in index funds, but I would also like to dabble a fair bit in individual stocks. Too much, I think, looking back now. And I actually think, why did I not commit more to my first bedrock principle, simplicity? Yes, to be honest, I was successful with some individual stocks, but to put it frankly, for want of a better term, I had some stinkers. I had some individual stocks that did not go really well. And I look back and I think, you know what? If I just, allocated the money that I'd put into those individual stocks into a simple, low-fee, broadly diversified index fund, that would have been far better for my overall portfolio. So I think that would be a regret, not kind of adhering to what has now become my 5 bedrock principle, simplicity in particular. And I think another one would be the initial hesitance and reluctance that I had to not really fully listen to John. So circling back to kind of the cognitive biases, a key one for me was in-group bias. So I'd listen to John on those first 2 or 3 occasions, and he'd sit me down, have a coffee, speak about investing. And I was like, well, I'm not so sure. Inwardly, my inner voice, I wouldn't say it's John, but in my inner voice, I'd be thinking, gambling, investing's gambling. You don't want to do it right. So remember, it was really mentioned at home, but whenever it was, investing's gambling, don't invest, And now looking back, I think, I was a victim of in-group bias. I let my in-group, i.e. my family, dictate my views on investing. And I was naive and ignorant there. And luckily, I was humble enough to kind of have, the presence of mind to kind of eventually see the error of my ways. I go back, if I just go into something that I love viewing, I don't know why every now and again, but there's a British Italian chef called Marco Pierre White. Have you heard of him at all? Marco Pierre White?
Mm-hmm, yep, definitely. So it's been on TV here.
He's got this great talk that he does at Oxford. And he should be, if he's not in the culinary world and more, he should be a storyteller because he did this 1-hour talk at Oxford. And it's about 25 minutes in. And he talks about presence of mind. He speaks about, for example, he's got all of these, undergraduates, postgraduates on tenterhooks, all literally on the edge of their seat. And he speaks about, it's reading this book, it's watching the chefs, it's knocking on that one particular restaurant where I got lucky. Success is about luck. It's born out of luck. It's what you do with that luck that makes a difference. So it's having presence of mind. And when Marco Pierre White used that phrase, presence of mind, that struck a chord for me. And that's a point I want to make, as I also make to my students as well as an educator. Have presence of mind. There are some opportunities that will come your way in life. Don't look them up. Don't disregard them. Don't kind of think, that's not for me. Have that presence of mind. And I'm grateful now looking back that I had the presence of mind to kind of finally be open-minded enough and humble enough to kind of take on John's advice and to really dive deeper into investing. So there are 2 things for me. So A, it's investing too much in individual stocks from the outset. And then B, it's not taking John serious enough when he spoke to me about investing. Those are two key ones.
You've been referring to John. Is this your father-in-law or your podcast co-host?
I should have clarified. So John is my father-in-law. John is someone who's that was the person that really, really got me into investing. He was a catalyst. He was the one that sat me down and started to get me into investing. So I have my father-in-law to thank in that respect. And it's funny actually because he visited us here in Hong Kong several months ago now, around about springtime. And he said, Roy, congratulations on the book. And he actually even humbly admitted, he said, I think you actually know more about investing than I do now. He said the fact that, I referenced Jack Bogle, Eric Balchunas, Vanguard, and so on. So I've become, it's funny actually, I really have been on a journey of investing, and I think I've become tremendously knowledgeable about investing, hence the book and my podcast and so on. And so John was a key figure there, really.
So what is the name of your podcast? How many episodes have you got? And who are some of the guests? You've had JL Collins on the podcast, haven't you?
Yeah, it's the Sloth Investor podcast. I've been lucky to have other financial authors on, such as JL Collins, Andrew Hallam, Eric Balchunas, Brian Feroldi, a lovely woman called Nikki Dunn as well. And just circling back to Eric Balchunas, he was a great guest to have on because he actually introduced me to some kind of concepts that I wasn't so familiar with. So he speaks in his book about how Jack Bogle was really keen on this Aesop's fable, the hedgehog and the fox. So that was something I wasn't familiar with, but he makes the point that Bogle loved this fable because he made the point that, well, what is it about the fox? Foxes are sly, they're cunning, they're very shrewd, quite devious, whereas a hedgehog has just that one thing, that one weapon, if you like, that it can use to deter the fox. It can curl itself up in the ball, it can use its spikes to kind of deter the fox. And he makes a point to investing analogy, the fact that, we can have these really complex ideas about how to invest derivatives and this emerging market and this, India ETF looks hot this year and so on and so forth. But, purely investing in a low fee, globally diversified index fund, keeping it simple, one fund is the way to go. So Eric Balchunas probably explains it way better than I just did in my podcast, but I love that. And another great point he makes that he touches upon how Jack Bogle would use this term relative predictability, whereby Jack Bogle makes a point, why is it that so many Vanguard investors are inherently so well behaved when it comes to geopolitical strife, when it comes to, the inherent ups and downs of the stock market? Vanguard investors, they inherently know that, the long-term trajectory of the stock market has been to go up. Yes, the stock market can fall down like an elevator, but the stock market gradually moves up like a staircase. And I love that notion of the relative predictability of the stock market. And I speak in my book about this kind of swan approach. Index funds allow you to sleep well at night. I love that kind of analogy, sleep well at night, the acronym, if you like. So yeah, they were great takeaways from my interview with Eric Balchunas. If anybody wants to learn more about Jack Bogle, I recommend his book, The Bogle Effect. And just to go to JL Collins, he's been, going back to kind of psychology as well, something that I take from JL Collins and Andrew Hallam, but JL Collins in particular, is optimism. So JL Collins is a really avuncular guy, very charismatic, quite humorous, loved having a chat with him, really lovely guy, and just really optimistic. That's something that I really was able to imbibe from his books, The Simple Path to Wealth, and more recently, Pathfinders. It's just the overriding sense of optimism. The stock market, there are going to be times when there's geopolitical strife, tariff issues between China and the US, and talks about, the Middle East and so on and so forth, but just keep on plugging away, stay the course, and the optimistic mindset is really critically key. And yeah, so that's something I really take away from JL Collins, not only his approach to simplicity, but also optimism as well, yeah.
So tell listeners about the book and where they can find it.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Phil. So the Sloth Investor is out today. It's available on Amazon Australia. Booktopia, I believe you have as well, don't you? Booktopia is where my Aussie buddy in Melbourne has been buying it from.
That's
Booktopia.
right, yep.
But yeah, Amazon Australia. And yeah, I've got quite a few followers on Twitter that are Aussies. I've always had a kind of a deep affinity for Australia. And of course, us being Stones fans, we would know that Mick Jagger's mother, I believe, has Australian connections as well. So yeah, I'd love to maybe at some point in the future head on over to Australia, maybe give some talks there. But yeah, excited that the Sloth Investor is out around the world and looking forward to it growing in Australia. I really am.
R.P. Stevens, let's quote the Rolling Stones again. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you'll find you get what you need. That's right, isn't it?
Thank you so much. That quote has given me much satisfaction. Thank you so much. It really has. Couldn't resist on myself there.
Boom, boom.
Yeah. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah. Two Stones fans. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Roy. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Shares for Beginners. You can find more at sharesforbeginners.com. If you enjoy listening, please take a moment to rate or review in your podcast player, or tell a friend who might want to learn more about investing for their future.